Thanks, Scott, and thank all of you. Good morning. It's hard to feel despair on a weekend featuring a visit from the Pope, a total eclipse later tonight of a supermoon, and the Prairie Festival. Not to mention Ann Zimmerman doing that. Oh my goodness. That beautiful rendition of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. That was pretty soul-stirring stuff. And yet, we often do despair, don't we? We worry about our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren and what they will face in 40, 50, or 100 years. How will they deal with a world in which we've willfully squandered so many of the resources that must have seemed virtually limitless to our own grandparents? Well, one of the ways I deal with my despair is by going to work. I have the great privilege and joy of working for an organization focused on solutions, or at least on ways to create, as Wes likes to say, a softer landing. It's enormously satisfying. And once a year, I get to deal with my despair by being at the Prairie Festival, when even in a year without a full moon or an eclipse, well, I don't think we'll have any years without Ann Zimmerman, but we might not have the full moon and the eclipse. But I know any year I will see so many of the people who make this work possible with their generous support. Thank you to all of our friends of the land. Many of you are out there. We literally could not do this work without you. I also know every year I'll hear inspiring speakers who will broaden my thinking and help me find, if not always hope, at least meaning in my despair. Mary Evelyn Tucker offers elegant insight into what Eleanor Sterling, director of the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History, calls the intersection of ecology, religion, and ethics. She is co-director of the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale University, where she teaches in an MA program between the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Divinity School. With John Grimm, she organized 10 conferences at Harvard on world religions and ecology and edited the 10 resulting volumes. She co-edited Confucianism and Ecology, Buddhism and Ecology, and Hinduism and Ecology. With Brian Swim, she wrote The Journey of the Universe and is the executive director of the Emmy Award-winning film Journey of the Universe that aired on PBS and which she spoke about at the Salina Arts Center in 2013. She served on the International Earth Charter Drafting Committee and was a member of the Earth Charter International Council. She is a trustee of the Thomas Berry Foundation. With co-author John Grimm, also her husband, she wrote Ecology and Religion as part of the Island Press Foundations of Contemporary Environmental Studies series. Near the end of that volume, Tucker and Grimm describe an encounter with a massive glacier that had been melting much faster than expected, calving off huge chunks of ice off the coast of Greenland as they participated on a boat with 150 or so scientists, scholars, and religious leaders in a symposium led by the Greek Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. Gathered on the deck, we were exploring, indeed witnessing, the effects of global warming in the Arctic region of Greenland. Ironically, we were also aware that we participate in the industrial world causing this loss. With all that had been written about climate change, here it was before our eyes. To see this was deeply disturbing. Our human impact on global warming was evident. As we began our symposium, we wondered what gesture is possible in the face of such stupendous beauty and incredible loss. The Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew gathered religious leaders of various denominations at the bow of the boat. A few words were said, and then silent prayer was offered. A penetrating quiet settled in, passing across all the participants. The only sound was the lapping of the waves against the boat. The aquamarine water was brilliant against the blue-gray sky. Then, with gracious humility in the presence of such natural splendor, the patriarch turned toward the glacier in silence. No words could capture this moment fully as we drew in the shimmering glacier with the occasionally calving icebergs. Nature was speaking. Humans were listening. Suddenly, the stillness was broken as a small boat drew near, and the sound of music drifted across the water. Inuit in traditional dress were singing songs of welcome. In the distance, we could see other Inuit coming to meet us in kayaks. As they drew closer, some 100 strong, the music swelled, and there were few dry eyes. We were visitors from around the globe, being met by indigenous peoples in this remote region. We were bound by a common concern for the fate of the planet. How can one despair in a world in which Mary Evelyn Tucker lives and writes?
That is the first, and that was so beautiful. But I have to say how very touched I am to be here. So I hope I don't cry during this talk, to be honest. You know, this is the most authentic place in the country, for sure. And when the Kansas song came on, I was crying. I can tell you that. But I really do want to thank all the people who make this possible, and certainly Wes and Joan, the staff, Tim, Darlene, all those who've cooked, all those who've served, the board, Vivian and Don Worcester, friends from a while back, and so many others who are here supporting a dream, a vision, something that seemed impossible. And the reports yesterday of the scientists here were just stirring, weren't they? So, yes, they were stirring. And you know, the most refreshing thing about this festival is no PowerPoints, because I like to say I'm powerless and pointless. But you know, our teacher, Thomas Berry, used to give the most incredible shout-outs to Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson and Don Worcester's work and David Orr and John and Nancy Todd and Herman Daly and John Cobb. And I feel all these people that he was identifying literally several decades ago are coming from peripheries into the center. And that's partly what I want to talk about today, with this movement of spirituality, ethics, religion, ecology, a whole range of movements, but of people who've been driving this for a long, long time. And I do just want to say, anyone who knows what it is to sustain an institute, a marriage, anything, is huge. So to sustain this institute for 40 years, I think the greatest celebration tonight is this harvest moon deep eclipse. So let's give it up for the Institute for Wes and Joan. So we all have our little stories, and I do want to just say mine is probably very much like many of yours, a 60 story. I went to college at Trinity. Kathleen Sebelius was 2 years ahead of me. Nancy Pelosi was a few more years ahead. And we were working, as many of you were, on civil rights, on the anti-Vietnam War, and so on. And that kind of social justice background, I think, is what sustains many of us up until the present. But I have to confess, when Nixon was elected, I was so disillusioned, having worked for the McGovern campaign and so on. I said, I'm leaving the country until he gets out of office. And I did, but by circumstances. I went to teach in Japan at a university there. And I was, pretty young. And it's a long story, but it was the most disorienting experience of my life to go to the Orient because we had no college classes in this, much less, weren't many books even. So the notion of worldviews and how they impact us that John spoke so eloquently about today was a huge wake-up call, at 22 or 3. But how they shape us, I was like, good grief, these people are shaped by Buddhism and Confucianism, and we don't know a thing about it. And I want to know why they're so polite to each other. What makes them tick? What makes the society work? So I started doing Zen Buddhism over there and so on. I was getting out of a Zen Buddhist retreat in August, and I look at the newspaper, Nixon resigns, I can come home. And in coming home, it was really a 10-year process to deconstruct and go through what are these cultures? What are these? And I call them cultures because I want to just put the R word on the back burner for a bit because it can turn people off. But these are religious, spiritual, ethical cultures and worldviews that have shaped people for thousands and thousands of years. And I became particularly interested in Confucianism after I realized that is actually what drives the cultures of East Asia, China, and Japan. And if you put that all together, Confucianism has influenced more people than any other tradition on the planet, actually, just historically speaking. I was like, what is this that makes China the oldest living civilization on the planet, one that could have irrigation systems, organic agriculture, societies that thought about the common good? The oldest irrigation systems in the world are still working in Sichuan and so on. So this is a society, a system that actually says, what John said yesterday, interdependence is at the heart of everything. There's no human without others, concentric circles, the human, family, society, education, politics, nature, and the cosmos. Tremendous. That's their cosmology, their worldview. An educational philosophy that says you value who you become as a human, and you value that because the political philosophy is for a common good. I'll tell you, our students love this when they get a hold of it. They are absolutely fascinated. You see, so that sense of how cultures try to shape a future that we can buy into, that we can be part of, is something that my husband, John, and I, and he sends warmest greetings, that we felt as we studied these with Thomas Berry, his specialties, indigenous traditions, Native American traditions, and we were closely involved in the Crow tribe up in Montana, and Haskell College here is such an important part of the community college systems for the tribes. So what we said, though, was, well, we're not scientists, we're not food, soil people, we can't do what Wes is doing or some of these other great leaders. But we can examine what the different cultures are saying about nature, about humans, about what we value in terms of life. And so we started in on this impossible task at the most scary university in the world, namely Harvard, and I was scared witless to do these conferences. I'd literally go out and hug this big tree in one of the beautiful gardens up there. And because, religion in any secular university is like, whoa, keep it away. But John Cobb was at the Christianity conference, and he's been a great supporter of this work for many, many years. And somehow, for whatever reasons, I really think the universe allows things to be born. It's way more than any individual, for sure. And so things just exploded for 3 years of these conferences, and then 7 more years of the books, and so on. But I want to say all along, it was to do something in relation to science and policy and law and economics. And so we had these partners. We called them SEEP, Science and Economics and Education and Policy. But it was very clear that we need as well culture, values, religion. That's what's going to motivate people, among many things. It's not I beg to differ with many of my colleagues at this wonderful school of the environment, the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. It's not the economic valuing of nature that is going to get us through this. Sorry. And believe me, we just had a panel this last week where the president of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development was there from the Netherlands, and Francis Beinecke, the former head of NRDC, and Pavan Sukhdev, who's led this economic valuing of nature. And apart from the World Business Council gentlemen, everyone agreed on this panel that what the Pope is doing is going to trump almost everything else. So this is what I'm going to talk about, in a few moments. What is the Pope doing? Which I think is beyond description almost. But I just want to give you this one example of why, when the doors open and we have this opportunity to go through, I say to my students, go through. And I really want to say, any of you who are teachers or you're in touch with your own children, we don't have children, but we feel our students are our children, and it's all about the next generation, for sure, for us. And I would say these students at the Environment School are charged up to make a difference, and they will. I don't think, I share the sense of despair often, but this generation, I feel immense hope with them, if we can just give them that sense that we share their times of loss, of disempowerment, and so on, but we can also urge them to the next stage. So I just want to give this quick example before I go to the Pope of what happened after this series of conferences at Harvard. Amazing energy. People came from all over the world. It was before 9/11 and so on. People paid their way from Asia when we didn't have money at the beginning. No one was paid to write these essays or whatever. It was this sense that culture and values have a role here. It's why the Heartland holds cultural values alive right here in Kansas. You see it everywhere. The land speaks of it, that wild blue indigo song. Oh my goodness. Right? It's just incredible. It's palpable. So this was the story. We come down to the Natural History Museum in New York and in 1998, and we meet with the provost there, Mike Novacek. Again, I'm scared witless. And because I'm saying, in this great Natural History Museum, do you think by chance we could do something that would allow people from the world's religion in the door here to say that there's something about valuing nature in other ways and environmental ethics? And he sat back within 10 minutes and he said, absolutely. And we'll give you the IMAX theater rent-free. Several thousand people came to this. 1,000 people came to the UN for this conference. We had people from the world. We were bringing all the partners. We had educators, President of Columbia, World Bank people, policy people, Jane Lubchenco, one of our best scientists, just head of NOAA, as you may know. But he said, we need you here because we've just had a search for an ornithology position for study of birds, and 6 of the final candidates, 4 of them had their birds go extinct while they were studying them. Electrifying, right? I mean, what a wake-up call for the neutral valuing, objective valuing and study of nature within one of the great science-based museums in the world. It swept through the museum. They opened up the Hall of Biodiversity, which has on its floor, we are in the midst of a 6th extinction. They're not arguing about the nuances of this. We are in the midst of a 6th extinction. This is why people are saying we're in a new geological period, the Anthropocene, okay, because of the human-induced changes on the planet. And Barry used to take it even further back. He said, way before the Anthropocene even was a focus, he said, we are shutting down the Cenozoic era. This is the age of the dinosaurs, when the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. He said, we have to see this in the long term, in the deep time, like you do at the Land Institute. Deep, deep time changes our perspective. And that sense that, yes, we are causing an extinction spasm leads to despair, but it can also lead to new openings and possibilities. And that's this shift, as I say, in the heart of a marvelous museum, science-based museum, which the Donnellys have supported, including that fabulous hall of biodiversity. And astonishing to see children look up at this explosion of life with this huge octopus above it, and birds and reptiles and insects and so on. This all came about in this last geological period, this explosion of life. And I just want to say, for those who might not care about religion and so on, one of the reasons we did Journey of the Universe, which is a telling of this evolutionary story, and the way people like Strawn love to study the science, the changes in ecosystems and so on. And we were trying to do this over a period of 10 years, where the science of emergence, of self-organizing properties, of change over time, could awaken awe, wonder, beauty, complexity, a sense of, wow, we are part of this deep time. We are together in a vast and unfolding universe. How does that light us up? How does that change our perspective? Scientists have known this forever, but there's a number of scientists, including our colleague Jeff Bowen is here from Bucknell, and Craig Cockle doing geological time and plate tectonics, helped us with a lot of the science and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, in that, we were weaving together the best of modern science over the last 100 years and saying what inspires both science and people with a spiritual sensibility is awe, wonder, beauty. That's what's going to sustain us in this period of shutting down of ecosystems, of tremendous loss, that we can still say there is complexity in everything here in the prairies that Wes and his scientists and team are bringing up into focus. It's no longer just down there. It's the depths of the soil and these grasses, and they're present to the human community through the Land Institute in a way almost never before. That's what's historic here. These great plains are present to us with their complexity and light us up in the imagination and in practical work. So in all of this, then, I'm suggesting that the changes that are before us are pulling us to the marathon of this movement into, you can even say, a new period. Thomas Berry called it the Ecozoic era. It's, as I say, some people are calling it the Anthropocene. It is going to take all of our energy. It's going to take all of our creativity. It's going to take immense and endless, I would suggest, spiritual energy, the energy of the human spirit. At the same time that we're looking for physical resources and so on, the most important resource, I would suggest, is something of the human spirit, of human energy that will make this change possible. And if we can sustain that, if we can inspire that, we can make the changes, because we have a good deal of the science, the ecosystem science. We've got tremendous policy papers. We've got technology, industrial technology, solar energy technologies, and so on. We've got legal systems that can do this. The missing link right now and ahead of us is this mysterious sense of what are we as humans trying to contribute toward of a flourishing planetary civilization, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and so on. But we are creators of culture and even of civilization. That's at the level, Thomas Berry was saying, everyone has a great work to contribute to this. Local, global, national, state. The great works are ahead of us. And so what is it that the Pope is tapping into at this historical moment? And I do think this is one of the most challenging but most exciting moments in human history, when we realize that as we understand ourselves as part of this vast 14 billion year universe process, as we see ourselves as part of 4.6 billion year old Earth system, that it took 2 billion years just to create the first multicellular entity. think of this unbelievable system and this creation, I use that word carefully, but this emergence of life out of time, deep time, and processes that we only have glimpses of. We hardly knew that the elements of our body came out of supernova explosions. You see, we're related to the stars. The stars are our ancestors, as we say in this. We did not know that. Our great-grandparents really did not know that. We didn't know about plate tectonics causing volcanic movements of the earth, and therefore life could emerge. So this historic moment, when we're awakening to this beauty and complexity, and we're also realizing the sense of loss, the sense of deterioration of species, of ecosystems, of traditional environmental knowledge, and so on. And we're seeking, as is Don Worcester in his latest book, to be coming out in the spring, a sense of how do we deal with limits, and what does that mean to even imagine limits to the economic drives and the other drives. That is a huge, huge challenge. So, into the mix of this complex historical moment, challenging, opening, possible change, comes Francis. Francis, an 800-year-old saint. It's the first time in the history of the church that name has been taken. It's fantastic. It's amazing. As someone said, though, yesterday, well, maybe it was for humility, because to take that name takes on a huge, huge legacy, of the poor and of nature, the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor. And that is what Francis, the Pope, is about, carrying that legacy forward. And why is it that people are so inspired? Why is this human energy flowing forth? Someone wrote me about being at Central Park yesterday, and she was in the section where they had people with wheelchairs and the immobile and disabled. People waited for 3 hours to go through these lines, and people, with their walkers and so on. It's just incredible, this outpouring of energy. But his response to these, it's like what we saw with Anne Zimmerman. There's no ego there. This is like you're speaking from, well, maybe there's a little bit, who knows? But you feel authenticity. You sense the gravity and yet the levity of a person like that. He's like, well, pray for me, and if you don't pray, send good wishes my way. It's really quite astonishing. So this sense then that we're scaling up to a level of hope, I would say, that in our lifetime we may never see again in the same way. So let's take it in. Let's drink of it, of pure water, or the greatest wine that we can imagine, what nourishes us, and the food that's soul food here. Because he's speaking, of course, to an audience of over 1 billion Catholics and altogether over 2 billion Christians, but very clearly he is speaking to the people of the world. And I was in Asia twice this summer, in Korea and Hong Kong and Japan and so on, in Beijing earlier. People are really listening to this, you see. But why? Because he's saying there's no future without a shared future. There's no common hope without our common home in front of us. And he's using these wonderful metaphors, our common home. This is so far from political language. This is the language of metaphor, which captures the human heart and soul. So, his goals from this encyclical, there were certainly short-term goals, but there's also long-term goals. And the notion then, his talk in Congress, you will love this. One of my friends said, this was definitely a work of mercy, visiting the sick in Congress. Don't you love it? Don't you just love it? I mean, so he had, of course, he has these short-term goals. I mean, when I heard this a year ago that he was going to address Congress, the first ever, I was just like, this is amazing, truly amazing. But the UN as well. He's bringing people in, and he's weaving the most incredible, I would say, between all the extremes. He's not preaching, is he? He's reaching into this human sense of why we care about each other. And not just our families, our communities, and well beyond. He's taking that sense, which all the world's traditions have, of moving us towards comprehensive compassion for the earth community. Now, this is old in the world's religions, honestly. This is one of the great goals of Confucianism, comprehensive compassion. And one of the great sayings is from Chongsai Western inscription, that I am part of a whole, and I care about the orphan and the weak and the widow and so on, but I am part of this larger whole. And that is what he's doing. That's the note that John Cobb struck yesterday. It's our community is being extended and rebooted, if you will, retrieved from these great cultures of the world to say, yes, the golden rule is essential, but this is the golden rule for the whole earth community. Because and that includes air and water and soil, these key elements of the Land Institute. It's the ecosphere that West likes to talk about. He is really saying the compassion, the extension of care and concern is for the health of the ecosphere. The health of the ecosphere within this sense that we have evolved from everything else. Because he calls on Teilhard de Chardin, and he calls on some of these larger thinkers of this perspective. So, short-term goals, talk in Congress, talk in the UN, the Paris talks, right, for climate change and so on. He's definitely trying to move that forward. But here's the thing. This is not just an encyclical about climate change. This is an encyclical in which he says over and over again, it's about ecological conversion. That's the phrase he uses. It's quite amazing, ecological conversion to this sense of a profound, interwoven, interdependent worldview. Again, what John was urging us towards. So he says the term integral ecology, people and the planet. And many of us realize these have been separated. There's often the social justice over here. There's the ecology over here. We've been doing a series at Orbis Books on ecology and justice for 20 years, and there's 20 books in this series. This weave is present here already. One of the key books in that series is Leonardo Boff, the liberation theologian from Brazil, and that book is called Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. He was central to the encyclical, you see. There's another book called Just Water. There's another book on indigenous views of ecology and justice. So that's what he's putting together, and things that our next generation is pressing for. Environmental justice, we've got to get this right. And the Pope, of course, is saying over and over again, who is suffering from the unintended consequences of climate change, of pollution, and so on? The poor, the vulnerable, women, children, people in coastal waters, especially, well, all over the world, but in Asia, 2/3 of the world's people are there. The glaciers that are melting not only in Greenland, the Himalaya region, 50 million people in the Ganges plain, the Gangetic plain, depend on those, as well as all throughout Southeast Asia and so on. It is of staggering proportions. They are already doing adaptation in the Himalaya region. So this ethical challenge then of climate change to deal with environmental degradation, but also climate justice, environmental justice. So I'm going to just go through, just very kind of at a hopefully nice pace, a little music pace here. What are the chapters? There's 6 chapters in this. How many of you have had a chance to read it? It's kind of a long thing. Okay. So this is the Cliff Notes to the encyclical. But I want to just illustrate what he's trying to do. Because he's saying he starts with what's happening to our common home. And he brings up all of the problems that we know, right? And he takes us down this path, and he takes us to the state of the world, where he's saying pollution, waste, and climate change are some of the central problems. But water, biodiversity loss, inequity, these are the problems that he's trying to focus on. But we need scientific understanding of the widespread environmental degradation and poverty. So he says we've got to look this in the eye. We can't avoid it, right? But the good news is for our students, the next generation, they are on to this all the time. But you know, our office is in the Forestry Environmental Studies School. You go upstairs to talks almost every day that will stop you in your tracks on the acidification of waters, on the forest law, everything we know, you see. So how do we deal with that sense of loss, with the sense of despair creeping in to our consciousness, our hearts, that can be numbing, disempowering, paralyzing even? We've got to face that, and I think we even have to say to our students, these are paralyzing talks, these are paralyzing statistics. But in the second chapter, he goes to the gospel of creation, and he takes us from problems to promise, okay, to promise. And he uses this language that's quite eloquent and quite compelling, a very poetic language, incidentally. Just read 10 pages at a time, and you'll enjoy it that way, I think. But he speaks of the mystery of the universe. He speaks of harmony of creation. Now, we know we've got disequilibrium in ecosystems, but he's using that metaphor to say we're part of something much larger, these systems. And there's a universal communion, a fraternity, as he calls on his Franciscan roots, the sense of kinship with brother sun, sister moon, and so on, with all of the plants, animals, and the birds. So the patriarch Bartholomew, who is quoted in the introduction, was actually his great inspiration in many ways. And 20 years ago, just as we were starting these Harvard conferences, the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, with a magnificent sense of Eastern Orthodox theology, of the icon of the universe as reflecting the luminous light, you see, all of that inspired the patriarch in these amazing symposiums, largely on water, in the Danube and in the Amazon and so on, for 15 years. These were astonishing. And he would be talking about what we're doing is ecological sin. These are crimes against creation. And the Pope, they're good friends. They build on one another. And part of what the Pope is trying to do is rebuild that bridge to the Eastern churches. And at every time when the encyclical was brought out, we were at the UN just after it was brought out, they have an Orthodox theologian speaking, you see, to say your theology matters. That was true at the Vatican June 18th as well, along with a great scientist, head of the Potsdam climate change. So he's bringing science, he's bringing religion, he's bringing these back into conversation. So then he goes back from problems and promise, and he says, let's analyze this. This is the third chapter. And he says, what are the human roots of the ecological crisis? Now, he's playing on this historical roots of the ecological crisis that was a very famous article by Lynn White, a historian of technology and so on, who said the historical roots of the ecological crisis are Christianity and Judaism because of their dominion, right? So we've had this big argument especially in the Christian and Jewish traditions, is Genesis and dominion, the cause of the problem. Well, he's taking this step back, certainly out of that argument, and saying, what are these causes? What's the analysis here? And he is so straight shooting. He says, economic growth and progress without limit. Economic growth and progress without limit. Some of these people get it wrong. They're like, oh, he's red, he's communist, he's this and that. Well, liberation theology saw inequities growing in Latin America, just like we see them here at the panel at Yale on Thursday. the head of the business speaker said, 10 corporations own 80% of the world's wealth. 10%. It's just staggering, right? It is staggering. So yes, economic growth and progress without limit might be shifted, and he highlights market capitalism as part of the problem. Market capitalism. Now, there's an article in the New York Review of Books by Bill Nordhaus, who's an economist at Yale, and he's critiquing the Pope for saying, oh my goodness, market capitalism is causing the problem. No, don't you worry. Market capitalism is going to work on behalf of the trickle-down economics and so on. It's unbelievable. It's not even worth your time because you know the neoliberal argument. But I read it out at this panel at Yale because he says at one point, we have to see ourselves as part of the market economy. I said, no, we have to see ourselves as part of an earth community. That is a huge difference, So he is saying as well, as we know, and as John pointed out, excessive anthropocentrism, individualism, it's all about me, for me. How we value nature is for me, even for my health, and so on. So he's critiquing that. He's critiquing relativism as well. Moral values, can just be kind of smeared around. And he critiques especially this technocratic paradigm, an efficiency model. Technology is going to solve things, and so on. It is the way universities, many of them, are moving towards, and so on, even though they do have great intellectual potential to move us out of this as well. But this technocratic mindset and a waste economy is what he's critiquing. And nature as dead object. This notion, Thomas Berry used to say, and John Cobb again, the universe is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. Right? It's the most famous line of Thomas Berry, and he had many famous lines. Subjectivity. Why am I so glad not to have a PowerPoint? Because I can look at you. I can see you. I can see your eyes, your face. Seriously, it's so refreshing. But as well, in this analysis, he critiques not only nature as dead, as object to be used, and so on, but devaluing work and humans, which we know is part of this whole effort just to get a raise of the wage. It's incredible. So he's saying we need a new synthesis. That's big picture thinking, yes. But he goes into his fourth chapter and he says, okay, integral ecology is part of this new synthesis. Now, Thomas Berry used this term a long time ago, integral ecology, people and the planet, but integral because ecosystems are fundamental to this move towards an ecospheric sensibility of the whole. So it's ecology, economics, and equity interwoven, right? He also highlights cultural ecology, and those who've devoted time and effort to indigenous peoples in this area and elsewhere know that TEAC, traditional environmental knowledge of indigenous peoples who are well over, we're only 200,000 years as Homo sapiens sapiens. We haven't gotten our last name right yet, the wisdom part, but people have lived with environmental knowledge for a long, long time. He's saying we have to value this kind of knowledge of culture and peoples and so on. And this eco-justice that encompasses this intersection of people and the planet, some of this expands on what's known as Catholic social teachings of social justice, but it's being expanded to the earth community in very rich ways. So the fifth chapter then goes to what I love that's happening here on the land, and not just at the Prairie Festival. But he says, okay, so we've got the problems, we've got the promise, we've got analysis, we've got maybe an answer in integral ecology. Then he says, what are the lines of approach and action? And he doesn't go through a 5-point program. He says dialogue. this is really kind of interesting, as I was trying to get the structure of this. So he says international dialogue, national dialogue, bioregional dialogue, local dialogue. But he says we've got to have new dialogues with politics and economy, with religion and science. We cannot afford the splintering, certainly of our own environmental and justice communities. You see, they've been splintered for quite a while. We need this new integration, a new marriage, a new richness, that the future depends on collaboration and cooperation, not on the fine detail, well, you didn't quite get it right, from my view, or that can really divide us. So he's saying interdisciplinary cooperation, interreligious cooperation. And I would say this is kind of an interesting thing. So we've been at this school for 10 years, School of Environment and Environmental Studies, because Gus Beth, one of the great environmentalists, brought us there, because he said after 40 years of doing work based on law, he founded NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, he founded World Resources Institute, he worked in the Carter administration, he was head of UN Development Program. He said after 40 years, all these techniques are not working. We need ethics, spirituality, culture, the human. It's been out of the equation, you see. So this sense, then, of something interdisciplinary he wanted at Yale. So we came, as I say, 10 years ago. Don't repeat this. I mean, honestly, for 10 years, some of our science colleagues have never talked to us. I mean, and it's okay. We have a lot of friends. We're not too lonely. But at Bucknell, we had a lot of friends from the sciences in a smaller environment, okay? But what I'm trying to say is now they're actually talking to us because they are so intrigued by this encyclical. And they're even inviting us into their classes. I mean, it's amazing. So part of the shift in this dialogue, you see, that I'm trying to suggest is happening before our eyes. And that's what he's urging, okay? Because I'm trying to say to them over and over again, we need your science. We need your policy. We need your economics. Even your ecosystem service economics, okay, necessary but not sufficient. We've got to bring everyone to the table, you see? So this new synthesis then is the final one, chapter 6, where he says education, ecological education and spirituality. Whoa, that is very hard in secular academia, where I've been all my life, and I understand why. We say from the very beginning of all this problems and promise of religion and of spirituality and so on. And he just gave this speech in Philadelphia where he made that point about religious freedom. He's standing, in this historic site and so on. He says, we've got to get away from these extremes, the Pope is saying. But here's what he says in this new synthesis. New lifestyle within a web of relationships. Within a web of relationships. Now, every time this thing about new lifestyle comes up, right? You know what people say? I don't want to give up my da-da-da-da. Air conditioner, whatever. That word, remember the first Bush went down to Rio, the Earth Summit in '92, and he said, our lifestyle is not up for negotiation up here in the north. He literally said that, okay? And you know what one of my responses, I mean, no one is perfect. I flew here, et cetera, we drive cars. But what I do like to say, and I think those of you who who have children or grandchildren and so on, you have sacrificed more than you ever would have imagined, right? When they were born and throughout the raising of them into the future. Sacrifice is part of the human. And certainly in the Second World War, there was tons of sacrifice for victory gardens and so on and so forth. The question is, what's the language that's going to bring that forth for our common home, our common future? You see, where we can feel a shared sensibility of this. So he's calling for a covenant between humanity and nature, a new kind of covenant that will allow these webs of relationship to arise, and ecological conversion. He comes back to this at the end, again and again. And I love this phrase. He says, there's an authentic humanity is calling for a new synthesis. And he has this phrase with that. He says, it's like a mist seeping under the door that's coming into our consciousness. It's very poetic. It's really quite lovely. So it's not like this abstract idea. No, we're longing for something that has meaning, has depth, has transformative possibility, has genuine sense of care and compassion. So I am going to conclude, I think, with two things maybe that just highlight this. So what I'm saying is the energies of alternative and visionary places and people, such as the Land Institute and many others around the country, are now moving into the huge center of transformative possibilities. That's the thrill that you see, those of you who've supported these efforts for many, many years. But right before us, perennial wheat, unbelievable. But all of these alternative possibilities that you've held in your work, in your hearts, the transformative possibilities of this great work are now ahead because this historical moment of a pope who's genuine enough to wash the feet of prisoners and women, to visit the sick, and so on, in all kinds of settings, is bringing forward something of immense authenticity that the human spirit is yearning for. And he cited the Earth Charter in his encyclical, and here's what the Earth Charter says, which was an amazing effort out of the Rio conference to come forward with a global ethics for sustainable development that had ecology, justice, and peace at its heart. And it's the first international statement that also has, we're part of a vast evolving universe. Earth, our home, is alive with a myriad community of life, and native peoples at Rio +5 in 1997 were weeping because they saw their worldview in this document. But it highlighted the sense of ecological integrity. If we can keep these ecosystems flourishing, discover their immensely complex processes, we have this possibility of establishing the future of our planetary community. So what he says, and maybe I'll conclude just with this, it comes in the encyclical from the Earth Charter. He says, the encyclical and the Earth Charter say, as never before in history, common destiny beckons us to seek a new beginning. Let ours be a time remembered for the awakening of a new reverence for life. Let ours be a time remembered for the firm resolve to achieve sustainability, for the quickening of the struggle for justice and peace, and the joyful celebration of life. And that is my wish for you too, the joyful celebration of life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary Evelyn.